Was Tony Zappia, who was addressing us today. Tony was my mayor when I was chief executive of Salisbury. He was my mayor for 10 years, and Tony was a visionary, committed leader who always had the interests of the small man in his eyes. He was very, very popular in the community and carried a lot of weight in the council as a result. And it was a great pleasure, and we achieved a lot, the two of us, during that period. Tony, of course, I wouldn't want to have crossed him as the champion powerlifter that he was. He might have not been a happy result, but Tony has carried that popularity with the community into his role as the federal member for Makin. He's now in his 6th term as a federal member for Makin, which was previously a marginal seat. He's turned that into a strong seat for his party. He has a very strong interest in South Australia. He's a born and bred South Australian with a great passion for this state. And it's in that context that I've asked Tony to speak on where South Australia sits in the federal sphere. Would you please welcome Tony Zappia?
Stephen, firstly, thank you for that very generous introduction, and can I also thank you and Jill for hosting Vicki and myself here to this lunch today. To President Rajiv, to our fellow Rotarians, because I am an honorary Rotarian, to our visiting Rotarians from Japan and Belgium, and invited guests, can I say it is indeed an honour to not only join you today, but to be asked to briefly speak to you. As the first South Australian Rotary Club, the Adelaide Club has a proud record of 100 years of humanitarian service. And when you reflect on that 100 years and all of the projects and humanitarian issues that you have been associated with, not only would it take more than one book to record them, but you would have changed the lives of thousands of individuals, both here in Australia and overseas. As Rotary founder Paul Harris often would say, Rotary is about peace and goodwill, and I note that it's the 4th object in the objects of Rotary. But also in 1933, in one of his more significant speeches, he made the statement that Rotary stands for tolerance. Can I say that today, in the world we live in, we need Rotary and Rotarians more than ever before. As a Federal Member of Parliament, I am daily approached, and I mean daily approached, by people who have issues that involve the rest of the world in one way or another, and want us as Federal Members of Parliament in Australia to take an interest in those issues. The other interesting observation I'll make about Rotary today, and Stephen touched on it a little bit, but so will I, is that I noticed that the 7th pillar of Rotary has now become the environment and as a level of service. As the Parliamentary Chair of the Standing Committee on Climate Change, Environment, Energy and Water, it is an area that is dear to my heart. But can I tell you that when Stephen and I were at the City of Salisbury, we also then, 20 years ago, made it a priority for our council. And it is wonderful to see that perhaps our vision of the day has been embraced by a worldwide organisation. And Julie, when you were talking about Trees for Life, again, can I say to you that it's an area of personal interest, and one of the founders of that organisation is a personal friend of mine as well. So again, it's wonderful to hear that this club is pursuing that. But I'm here today to talk to you about South Australia's role in the national debate and in federal parliament. And indeed, it is an interesting question. And as I reflect on it, based not only on my nearly 16 years of membership of the Australian Parliament, but also over the history of our federation since 1901, it is something that is worth pondering. Can I tell you, in the 1890s, when the constitutional conventions were being held, there was an equality of representation from each of the states right around Australia. In 1901, when the Federation came together, the Australian population was 3.8 million. South Australia's population was 360-odd thousand, just under 10%. In the very first Parliament, there were 75 members of the House of Representatives and 36 senators. The senators were equal to each state having 6 senators, but the House of Representatives has always been representative of the number of population. And so we were allocated 7 seats in the National Parliament, roughly just under 10%. When you consider that in that first Parliament, there was 75 reps members, 36 senators, it was 111. South Australia had 13 of those members, not a big number. And indeed, Victoria and New South Wales alone had 61 members, more than 50%. So clearly they could dominate the debates, and all of the action, so to speak, was occurring in the eastern states. Today, the representation has changed, but not for the good of South Australia. We now have 10 House of Reps seats, 6 senators in a parliament of 227. We had at one stage, a couple of decades ago, reached 13 House of Reps members in this state, but because of population changes, that has now dropped to 10. Again, we have 7% of the national representatives in the federal parliament. So, not surprisingly, and somewhat disappointingly, since Federation, South Australia has never produced a Prime Minister, never produced a Governor-General, never produced a member of the High Court of Australia. I use those 3 areas because when you look at our Constitution, that is roughly the critical 3 areas of government and the separation of powers that flow from those positions. So you might ask yourself then, how insignificant has South Australia been? Well, the truth is we haven't been insignificant at all. And I could go through some of the history, but more importantly, I'll talk about the situation as I see it today. What we do have today in Federal Parliament is, for the first time ever, the Leader and Deputy Leader of the Senate in Penny Wong and Don Farrell, both being from South Australia. That is significant in many respects, not just because of the important portfolios they hold, with Penny being Foreign Minister and Don being Trade Minister, but because of their input into what I call the leadership team of the Albanese Labor government. And when I look at the other significant matter with respect to what is happening today, it is that we also have what I would describe as a young, dynamic, energetic and visionary Premier in Peter Malinauskas. And Peter, I know, addressed your club only a couple of weeks ago. And when I look at those 2 positions in the Senate and Peter as the Premier of this state, it is significant for this reason. Peter is working alongside a Prime Minister who also has a huge reform agenda. It's a big agenda, an agenda that will take the support, or need the support, of other state premiers. The situation right now reminds me very much of the Dunstan-Whitlam era of 50 years ago. At the time, for those of you who can remember, both Dunstan and Whitlam were reformist leaders. They both had a huge agenda, but they both supported one another and fed off one another in terms of the reforms they were driving, sometimes led by South Australia and the feds would follow, sometimes led by the feds and the state would follow. But the reforms that took place then transformed this country. And can I say, for all the criticism that they might have got at the time, just about all of those reforms have endured, which means that subsequent governments of the opposition parties as well did not tear them down because they were good for Australia. And so when you have premiers like Peter and a leadership in Canberra as we do today, where they, you might say, have a similar mindset, it makes a difference, and that is exactly what's happening. And so when I think about what are the big issues for Australia today, or for South Australia in particular, I know what the big issues are for Australia, but when I think about what are the big issues for South Australia today, I come up with probably 2, 3, maybe 4 headings. And the first one is climate change. Climate change is a global issue, as you all know, and climate change requires a change in the way that we all live as a society, and as a global society at that. And trying to bring together all nations of the world has not been an easy task. And in fact, each of the COP conferences proved to be more difficult each time they are held. But having said that, South Australia now has the proud track record of perhaps being the state that has adapted to and began the transformation process of adapting to climate change. That is important because it shows the way for us at the federal level to follow. And when you have runs on the board, it makes it easier to bring in legislation and make changes that you can point to and say, but it is working, and there's a prime example. And when you consider that South Australia has 73% of its energy from renewable sources, when you look at the $593 million hydrogen commitment made by Peter Malinauskas recently, and the battery storage in this state, again, those are all areas that are driving policy changes at federal level. And indeed, in the recent federal budget, $2 billion was allocated to support hydrogen conversion and hydrogen energy. Again, a good example of our state showing the way and being picked up by the federal government. The second area that I highlight is the River Murray. When I was elected to federal parliament, the River Murray was probably the single biggest issue on the agenda. It was literally towards the end of a 10-year drought. And some of you might recall how there was literally no water in the lower lakes, and the river itself wasn't even flowing. As a result of changes made by the incoming Rudd government at the time, I was placed on a committee which is loosely referred to as the Windsor Committee, because it was led by Tony Windsor, the independent member for New England, to look at the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. And Simon Crean, who was the relevant minister at the time, specifically asked me to go on that committee because he knew that I not only understood the river pretty well, but he needed a South Australian voice on that committee. The work of that committee effectively became the foundation of the Murray-Darling Basin Plan. It was a plan that was never supported wholeheartedly by the eastern states. It was a plan that continues to be undermined by the eastern states today. But it's a plan that has withstood the test of time, and which the current government, the Albanese government, has not only committed to delivering on, but has refused to buckle under the pressure from the bigger eastern states. Again, highlighting the, I believe, persuasive influence of South Australia. In simple terms, the plan allocated 2,750 gigalitres of water to be returned to the basin. And there was an additional 450 gigalitres to be added when it was possible, and I'm paraphrasing the specific wording of the legislation. Of the 450 gigalitres, can I tell you that the eastern states have been constantly trying to wipe that off the agreement. And to date, after 9 years of the last government, we have only delivered on 4.5 gigalitres, in other words, 1% of that. Tanya Plibersek has made it clear that we will deliver on the 450 and that we will deliver the 2,750 in full as well, no matter what it takes. And so again, South Australia's voice on that has unwavered and proven to hold firm against the bigger eastern states. The third area I will talk about briefly is defence. In the world we live in today, I'm sure you all know that there is so much uncertainty, so much fear within the community about the global situation. And defence has risen to be perhaps one of the most prominent areas of public expenditure and public conversation. Indeed, as a member of, perhaps the longest standing member of the Public Works Committee of the Parliament, I can tell you that defence spending is now the single biggest area of spending that the committee I'm on has to look at on a regular basis. But the importance of defence spending and South Australia goes to this. Again, back in 2007, when the two biggest issues that we were fighting for this state were raised, it was the Murray-Darling Basin and the replacement submarine program. They were the two biggest issues and probably continue to be. In 2013, when Tony Abbott decided that he would buy the Tsuruya-class submarines from Japan, it ultimately cost him his Prime Ministership because the contract didn't come to South Australia where the work would be done. And that's a story for another day. But I've got to tell you, it cost him his Prime Ministership. The current and latest version of the contract is that there will be 8 submarines built in South Australia. Again, not because there was no other place to build them. I can assure you there was fierce competition from some of the other states. So much so that even my side of politics had to carefully weigh up where they would be built. And I remember lobbying senior members of government about the whole issue. And I remember particularly some of my Western Australian colleagues who put up equally strong arguments as to why they should be built in Western Australia. And at times saying, and I can clearly recall one of my colleagues, and he's a good friend, he's saying, I'm going to speak about submarines in the next 5 minutes. You might not want to be in the chamber appearing to support me, given that I'll be arguing for them to be built in Western Australia. But they ultimately were built in South Australia, or they will be built in South Australia, in a program that will cost somewhere between $268 billion and $368 billion. It's hard to put an exact figure on it because they will be built over the next 30 to 40 years. And the significance of that program, in my mind, is not just about submarines. The truth of the matter is that I believe it's just as important, and even more so, that since GMH closed its doors in this state, that we have an industry that will rebuild the manufacturing base that this state prospered from for many, many decades. And the submarine contract, I believe, will do that. But in addition to the 8 or so submarines, we also got the 9 frigates, again, another $50 billion worth of work. And some of you might also remember that because of the lag in finding the right submarines for our need, there was a need to extend the life of the Collins-class submarines. Again, Western Australia bid fiercely for that. And I went to Western Australia and I saw the facilities they had there, and I've got to tell you, they had every right to bid fiercely, and they had the facilities that they could have done it as well. But South Australia again won out. And we got the contract to extend the life of the Collins class until the nuclear class submarines come here. And the last area where I think there was a real battle, and again we won out, and I think it was mentioned earlier on about the space industry and cyber security and cyberspace, etc. The space agency is at Lot 14 here in South Australia. Again, a decision that didn't come just out of pure luck, but came because we put together the right package and the right arguments. Now, I understand that my 15 minutes is just about up, so with that, what I can say to you is this. South Australia may not have had all of those key positions that I referred to earlier on, but rest assured that South Australia is doing and holding its own on the national stage. Thank you very much.
Question? Sure. Thank you, Tony. Questions? Are there a couple of questions from people? Yes, sir. I think that's a statement, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, look, you know, the submarines, as all of you would know, have been contracted in conjunction with both the USA and the UK, and it is pretty much a 40-year program, so let's see where it goes. But frankly, the work has already started. I was out at Osborne a month ago with the Prime Minister, and I can tell you that it's an incredible facility that's been developed out there.
Thank you for this very good address. I've got a strong view that Australia's energy policy is reasonable. We have one natural advantage in this country, that we're an energy-rich country, yet our policies are defeating the advantage we have in this country. Parallel that, I was in Norway recently, and Norway has the largest world sovereign investment fund from their oil industry. They too are embracing the concept of renewable and green. We see charging stations everywhere in Norway. However, they also put their policy of pricing energy will carry pricing. So the locals, whilst they are amongst the wealthiest per head population in the world on a GDP basis, are not happy with their energy policy. I think that as a country we need to rethink our energy policy and not give away the natural advantage we have and penalise businesses in Australia.
I think that is a very fair comment, and can I tell you that energy policy in this country is raised almost on a daily basis right now because of the rising energy costs. But one of my disappointments is simply this, that for the last 9 years that we were not in government, there were some 23 energy policies and not one of them stuck. And that's partly because the previous government did not adhere to or prepare what I would describe as a long-term energy plan for this country. We've been in government for 12 months. We accept that energy policy is the future. It was so critical to the future, and we're trying to put together a strategy that will actually not only bring energy down, but actually will ensure that we have a sustainable energy policy for this country. At the end of the day, without a sustainable energy policy and an affordable one, we can't rebuild our manufacturing.
Okay, just one quick one, David. Yeah.
Thank you, Tony. I know this is sort of outside of your portfolio a bit, but I wonder if you give us any insight into the progress that's being made from South Australian industry, wine industry perspective in terms of negotiating with China and
Again, another very important issue, because the wine industry for South Australia is one of our biggest industry sectors, and I'm well aware of that, given that my own brother is a wine grower. I spoke to Don Farrell, the Trade Minister, about this, and I also, for what it's worth, spoke to the Prime Minister about this in recent months. And I know that Don just got back from China, but I stressed to him that one of the big issues that we need to address is the collapse of our wine industry here in South Australia. They are both fully aware of it. They are both trying to get it back on track through new trade deals, and you might be aware that both with India and the UK there's been a new trade deal done. But I haven't spoken to Don since he got back from China about it, but I'm hoping that the market in China will be open again, because the truth of the matter is that for all of the other countries that might be interested, China was our biggest market.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you very much for your address. And while I present Tony with a certificate of appreciation accompanied by a donation to the club, would you please show your appreciation in the normal way? Thanks, Tony.